Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well because these are 10 modern classics that you must read. I'm going to give everybody a year to read these books. And by that, I mean I'm extending an invitation, asking you to join me in appreciating these masterpieces of 20th century literature, because each of these is a fantastic book. These are books that explore the human experience in all of its glorious detail, whether it is the incredible imagination humans are capable of, the human spirit, either indomitable or fragile, the heartrending horror that lies at the heart of far too many human experiences, the humor that people use sometimes to cope with their experiences or to celebrate and find joy in their experiences. These books are fantastic. I want you to picture 20th century literature as this massive feast that's been laid out. And there are all sorts of dishes and books to sample. And just about every reader has taken a seat at this table at some point or another and sampled a few works. And in fact, there have even been a couple of menus circulating around lately. Katie Books, Steve Donahue, James Holder, Michael K. Vaughan, each created a little menu that I'll link in the description box below. Brian over at Bookish made a sort of anti-menu, recommending works to avoid if you don't want literary indigestion. And I probably agree with Brian on a number of those works. But while everybody was sampling those works, the chef at the Modern Classics Cafe was restocking and looking for a few works that perhaps haven't been sampled recently. So let's find out what's on this menu. First up, we have Snow Country by Yasunari Kawabata. This is an extraordinary gem of a book. Kawabata's style was to try and take a story and collapse it, minimalize it, strip it down to its most essential details. And that's what he does here in Snow Country. It's a novel that, in its sensibility, evokes the Japanese haiku tradition. And Kawabata refers to this idea as sort of a palm in the hand story, the idea that you could take a story and shrink it down to its most essential detail and it would fit in the palm of your hand. And that's what we have here in Snow Country. We're set out in Western Japan in this incredibly snowy region, the title. And we have a character who's an older man, and we see the relationship he develops with a younger woman who's a geisha. We see the ways in which this relationship, they depend on each other within this relationship, even where they don't want to. The way in which each sort of recognizes that the other desires something that they cannot provide, that this relationship is incompatible, that it is not only unrequited, but it's like unknowingly unrequited and unfulfilled. And yet seeing that doomed nature within the relationship takes the romance and it shifts it in such an incredible way, in such a human way. And so this would be one I would recommend. And I read this a number of years ago. Kawabata has won a Nobel Prize in Literature, and so this is a work plenty of folks have read, but I intend to reread it in 2023, and I invite you to join me, as I will with all of these works. Up next, a work that I don't know I've ever heard referenced on BookTube, and it's a shame. That would be River of Fire by Qurratulain Hyder. And this is an incredible work that was originally published in 1959. Hyder herself did the translation 35, 40 years later from Urdu into English. Again, just an incredible feat. Sometimes I think this book has been reduced to just 100 Years of Solitude in India, but it is so much more than that. It's important to remember that Hyder was in some ways a contemporary, almost a predecessor of the great Salman Rushdie, who's been on a couple of these menus so far. But what we have here is a 2,500 year sequence of events. We see 4 characters and what I think is best described as different manifestations of these same 4 characters across the 2,500 years there in India and what is now India and modern Pakistan. Because the book ends in 1947 with the partition of India into India and Pakistan, an experience that Hyder herself lived through. She'd grown up Muslim in India, moved north into Pakistan, and then later on, about a decade later, moved back into India. And so her experiences highlight and illuminate the end of this book, but she's constantly exploring all of these ideas, because the 4 characters, the manifestations of characters that we follow across the book are Gautam, who sort of in some ways has this relationship and represents Buddhist thought. We have Shampa, whose name shifts across that and that represents Hindu thought. Kamal, who represents the Muslim experience, and then Cyril, who represents the Christian experience. And so we see their relationships with each other, the ways that the characters fall out of love, conceive of ideas and new ways to explore their identities. And we see the ways that type of thinking and thought has changed across 2,500 years in India. This is an extraordinary book that no summary can do justice to, but I would invite readers to join me in reading this in 2023. Up next, Explosion in a Cathedral by Alejo Carpentier. I mentioned Alejo Carpentier about a year and a half ago when I made the 5 perfect novels, and I said I want to list 5 novels that are perfect novels even though it's not the writer's single best work. Carpentier showed up there with the Kingdom of This World, which is an extraordinary novel. Explosion in a Cathedral, though, is his capstone, his masterpiece. Here we have a book published in 1962 that looks back, all the way back to the French Revolution and how it spilled over, its ramifications in the Caribbean. We have the real life Victor Hugo, who thought of himself and historically has been regarded as sort of a Robespierre there in the Caribbean, in Guadeloupe, a French department. And we see the almost magnetic pull he has right from the beginning when he shows up in Havana and begins to attract Esteban, Sophia, others to sort of fall under his sway. And we see the ideas of the French Revolution transferred to a very different locale, a very different milieu. And of course, what Carpentier wants us to examine is to think about all of this in the context of the 20th century, as there are new revolutions occurring. A revolution just years before he wrote this book. But I want to read the first 2 sentences of this because it probably serves as its own recommendation. I saw them erect the guillotine again tonight. It stood in the bows like a doorway opening on to the immense sky, through which the scents of the land were already coming to us across an ocean so calm, so much master of its rhythm that the ship seemed asleep, gently cradled on its course, suspended between a yesterday and a today, which moved with us. And we do move between yesterday and today in this work. Extraordinary. Up next, a work that I think a few folks have sampled, but I wanted to give it one last strong recommendation for your 2023 reading, and that is Ficciones by Jorge Luis Borges. Of course, his collected fiction is even better, but if we're talking 20th century, I don't know that there's a single short story writer who did more to push the boundary of what we felt a short story could be and the ideas that could be expressed in short fiction or microfiction than Jorge Luis Borges. Ficciones, which was a sort of anthology of his early stories, published in 1962, has just so many gems. Among those, of course, the great Tlon Uqbar Orbis Tertius, the Library of Babel, and the Garden of Forking Paths. Critical stories that, as I said, take the human imagination a few steps further than it had been before Borges. Another work that I think is just a writer who I think is essential in the 20th century would be Primo Levi. He is most famous, of course, for, I think, and justifiably famous for his Holocaust memoirs. But his book, The Periodic Table, in 1975, is something else. It is autobiographical in many ways. It's a series of stories that explore the periodic table of elements. Levi was by training a chemist, and so we see his display, his genius for chemistry in this book, in these stories. But we also see him examining his autobiography, his ancestry there, in his ancestors as Jews living in Italy. Before there's the horror of the Holocaust, we see his younger experiences. We see him training to be a chemist. Then we do, though, see stories set there in the concentration camp. And Levi is one of the few writers who's able to take those horrors, take those experiences, and try to articulate them in the most authentic and true way. To say that this wasn't about me overcoming fear, that he was truly afraid, and confronting death, not just on a daily basis, but at times on an hourly basis. And what that existence was like for him and for those around him. And so the periodic table is, I think, the work that is unclassifiable because of how it shows Levi reaching out into all these different aspects and facets of his experience and his knowledge, and then pulling it all back and unifying it into a human life. And that's what happens in the periodic table. There's truly nothing like it. Another work that I cannot recommend highly enough is, of course, Our Sister Kiljoy by Ondaatje. And I've seen more and more folks reading this, but not nearly enough, because this is a masterpiece. Ondaatje here has a very somewhat unconventional experimental novel, because it is prose, but there's poetry mixed in. It recalls the great Cain from Jean Toomer, the story cycle with poems that he had created. And here we have a writer who's trying to pierce ideas around the experience of an African woman or a woman living in the African diaspora. Because Ondaatje had those experiences. We see her experiences moving, and here the character's name is Sissy, but coming from being educated in Ghana and then moving into Europe and seeing this collision of culture and the interactions, and how do the interactions she has either from her past in Ghana or in her present in Europe, how do those shape and shift her sense of self, her own identity, and the triumph that is Ondaatje Edu's work is just extraordinary. Please read this book. I do plan to reread this in 2023, so join me. Another writer who is becoming, I think, a little bit more well-known, but still not nearly well-known enough, is Ngūgī wa Thiong'o, sometimes James Ngūgī, as he was originally known. And he's a Kenyan writer. Petals of Blood is probably his true masterpiece. Weep Not Child is focused more on the historical Mama rebellion in Kenya in the 1950s. But Petals of Blood is something else. There's a more visceral sense. There's a more confident writer on display here in Petals of Blood. And we have a crime. We have a triple murder. And we have four characters who are sort of drawn together to be interrogated. And it's not entirely clear, initially, which of them was involved, because their experiences are so different. One formerly was a guerrilla during the Mama rebellion. Another has been like a school teacher. We have one who's been involved in political activity, trade unions. And so we have this question around how could any one of these characters from all these different walks of life, how could they be involved together in this moment, in this crucible? And that is what Ngūgī wants to explore. He's one of those writers who takes a crime and takes the experiences of those around it and uses it to unpack a society. The novel was incredibly controversial. Ngūgī was imprisoned for writing this book. And so this is one that I think deserves a very close reading, a close rereading on my part. It was later republished in Penguin Classics, so it's certainly widely available. And this is one I'd encourage you to join me in reading. Up next, we have the book that I think extends the sense of what was happening in the great U.S. novel tradition, and that is Beloved by Toni Morrison, written in 1987. And the book that is just so empathetic as Morrison turns her light and her brilliant mind onto the absolute horror of slavery in the U.S. and what that experience was like for people who had been enslaved, for families, for parents, for children, and does so with a true characteristic on her part, love of humans, love of characters, and the sensory language that she's capable of. I think she's at her heights here. She is tapping into the darkest depths of a human experience, just like Primo Levi, and yet doing it with, and Ngūgī for that matter, and doing it with a sensibility that is just extraordinary. And so this is one that I'll be rereading later in 2023. I want to reread A Mercy first, because I think that thematically pairs so well with Beloved. But this is one that if you haven't read yet, just please put it on your 2023 TBR stack. Moving on, we have Women of Sand and Myrrh by Hanan al-Sheikh. And Hanan al-Sheikh is from Lebanon. This book does not seem to be set in Lebanon. At least it's not set in Beirut, which is where some of Hanan al-Sheikh's other works had been set. It is a fascinating work, though. It was at times compared to The Handmaid's Tale, because the way that we examine four different women, and the book is sort of broken into roughly like 60-page sections for each of these women, and we see their relationships as married women. What freedom does that confer? What security does that confer? But what freedom does that limit? What security does that limit? How are each of these women able to define their own identities? We have Suha, we have Tamer, Susanna, and Nur. And we see relationships that, again, were deeply controversial when this was written in the late 1980s, particularly for a woman living in an Arab nation. And so to see Hanan al-Sheikh sort of, again, shine a light on voices that had not always been represented in literature, and to do it so masterfully and so carefully is extraordinary. This is one that I would hope more readers are familiar with, but again, please join me in rereading it. And then finally, The English Patient by Michael Ondaatje. There have been a number of these works, Petals of Blood, Women of Sand and Myrrh, River of Fire, that have sort of four characters at their heart. And we have one more here, where we have Hannah, the young nurse, we have Caravaggio, the disfigured thief, we have Kip, the young sapper who is from Southern Asia, and then we have Almashi, a representation of a historical person. It's very different from the actual person. And we have a novel that is incredibly beautiful. We have a novel that is consumed by romance, by forbidden romance on various levels, cultural, social, that is consumed with relationships and the way that relationships truly shatter the people involved, and at their best refigure those people into new, just wondrous beings who feel completed, as they were in the great Aristophanes section of the Symposium. But there's a darkness here, there's a passion here that just keeps burning throughout this book, and so it is one of my favorite novels. It is, I think, a book that really taps into just what can be most beautiful in the most forbidding landscapes of the desert, and what can be most beautiful in the forbidden nature of human relationships. So my invitation is open. I will try to put together a more clear sense of which of these I'll read first. I'll likely dive into either Women of Sand and Myrrh or Snow Country in January. But I would encourage folks, if you've never read any of these, please join me in reading them. I wanted to make a list that was not a distillation of the modern library's top 100 novels of the 20th century, or the Times, 100 most important works since 1923 or 25, whenever Time magazine started being published. I wanted to make a list that wasn't just a distillation of that. We can all go look those up. I've looked it up. It was a guide for my reading. I've read more than half of the novels on both those lists. But I wanted to try and find works that I wasn't finding folks mentioning and saying, please go read these too. Read whatever you want, but consider adding one or two of these, or all 10, to your 2023 TBR. Let me know. I'd be happy to discuss each of these works with you. And I haven't done a video on any of these works in full. Borges' stories a little bit, but I plan to across the next year. So join me, and I hope everybody's having a wonderful start to this new year. Thank you.